Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring whistleblowing. It's a topic I've covered before, but today I'm exploring it from a completely different angle. My guest is a whistleblower who helped uncover one of the biggest financial frauds in recent history. Wirecard, a multi-billion-dollar deception that saw one of Germany's most high-profile fintech companies collapse overnight. His name is Pav Gill, and as former General Counsel at Wirecard's Asia-Pacific operations, his decision to come forward ultimately led to the company's downfall and exposed deep flaws in corporate oversight. But this episode isn't about Wirecard. There are plenty of other podcasts you can listen to hear about Pav's experiences, and I've covered the story before in a discussion with journalist and writer Dan McCrum, whose book Money Men details the entire scandal and the efforts to bring it to light. If you're unfamiliar with it, you might want to listen to that first. There's a link to it in the show notes. What I'm exploring with Pav are the dynamics of whistleblowing, the obvious and the not so obvious, as well as exploring why whistleblowing matters and the conditions required to allow it to occur. We also talk about the challenges of encouraging whistleblowers to do the right thing, whilst also ensuring that rewards don't create perverse incentives. Why do some whistleblowers struggle to move on, while others manage to use their experience as a platform for new opportunities? How does the stigma around whistleblowing affect future career prospects? And how can organisations differentiate between legitimate concerns and malicious reporting? Why is closure so important? Not just for whistleblowers, but also for the organisations involved. As I say to Pav on the show, the kinds of issues he raises in our discussion are a little bit like whistleblowing on whistleblowing. It's an inner expose of some of the complexities, contradictions, and challenges behind the process. We also talk about the thinking behind Confide, the end-to-end whistleblowing platform that Pav's new startup of the same name is developing. As someone who's handled whistleblowing cases inside organisations and been one himself, it's a challenge he's uniquely qualified to manage. So we also discuss what it takes to build an effective whistleblowing system, the psychological and logistical challenges of speaking up, and why whistleblowing isn't always as simple as we might assume. So whether you're interested in the dynamics of getting people to speak up, or have a professional interest because you're in compliance, risk, legal, ethics, HR, or just business leadership, I think you're going to find this fascinating. My discussion with Pav Gill on whistleblowing that works. Pav, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you here. You're someone that I've wanted to get on the show for ages. And the story that has really brought you to prominence and really defined what you do now is obviously the Wirecard one. And that's a well-known tale. So I'm not going to get you to retell that. But what are you up to these days? Tell my listeners about a little bit about what's happened to you since Wirecard.
Well, I'm now a founder and CEO of the Confide platform, which is a company that I came up with. What we do and function as is as the world's only end-to-end whistleblowing solution. When I say that, why it's the only end-to-end solution is because a lot of these solutions out there focus primarily on receiving reports only. But based on my experience, not only as a whistleblower, but as experienced General Counsel, I think the true function and value would be not only in receiving, but in being able to manage everything on platform for the audit trail.
And I think it's really interesting because you're obviously well equipped to understand from the perspective of someone that's going through it, what an organization needs to do. And I always sort of say as shorthand, people often think of whistleblowing as being a logistical problem, right? If we just put a process in place, we'll put a reporting line in, we'll have a phone line, job done. And I think there's a lot more complexity to it. And we often think about the sort of logistics of it. We don't necessarily think about the psychological piece and the management of the process, recognizing that ultimately what this is human beings stepping up to doing something that is unusual, that isn't something they've necessarily done all the time. And so I love the idea that you clearly have approached this, I hate the word, but holistically, looking at the entire situation, really recognizing not the sort of theoretical dynamics, which is, we need people to speak up and logically they should, but recognizing the realities of it and therefore the things that need to be managed behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also in a way a check and balance. So if you think about, there's always doubts as to how trustworthy the case manager is on the other side, where his interests and loyalties are. But then if you have a platform where you have raised this to that very case manager and everything that he's going to be doing is going to be audit tracked and logged, I think that in itself serves as a check and balance, because even if he's like a pure sycophant type figure, I think he'll be forced to behave a bit more sensibly if he knows that, whatever he's doing in terms of the investigation and managing that case is going to leave an audit trail. So I think that's where these kind of subtle effects, if you want to call it that, also kick in, which is at the end of the day what companies need, right? If you think about the scenario today, if something happens in any company and things blow up, everyone's scrambling around looking for where things started, who dealt with it, who was involved, what happened at the end. And there's just a broken data process out there. You may have received something in a hotline, in an email, then you had various meetings, you went to different Jira tickets or Slack conversations. Why do we need to do that when you can have like a single source of truth? So that is actually like the objective that I was trying to solve. It's really about using tech to be more efficient and managing a lot of these things. At the end of the day, to me, whistleblowing is a form of risk management. That's what I still see it as. And I think if we approach whistleblowing or the whole raising of concerns, whether they are financial crime concerns or HR concerns, for example, bullying, harassment, and even like data breaches, right? Like, oh, there's been a data breach. How do we report this? I think we need some form of safe escalation mechanism in place because they are, as I said, risk issues. And from an operational risk standpoint, from a business risk standpoint, any kind of risk standpoint, you need to be able to flag it and raise it, and also then have the company deal with it.
And so I guess you're looking at two things here, right? One is the logistics bit, right? Which is making sure that you can manage it, you have documented it, you've got everything is in order, put it that way. But the second bit is, as you want to make, is that psychological thing, right? Which is to say to the employees, actually, we've got a system here that really takes things seriously and means we have to take things seriously. Because if we didn't, that would cause us a problem. And so when you hand something over, recognizing that, as is in your case, right, there's plenty of reasons why people, might not want to come forward, might not trust the system. It's difficult, challenging for them. It's not something they're regularly doing. You're thinking about that. And so it's really a contract, I guess, with the employees as well to say, look, we will take this seriously, right? We were investing in this properly and we really care about it. And even if you think we don't care about it, we have to, because we've created that audit trail.
Yeah. And a lot of these existing mechanisms in place, what happens is you just launch the report and you might, if you're lucky, get a random update, but you don't have control over the process. You don't have the ability to dynamically engage with the case person. The one managing it. So I think, at the end of the day, as a human being, like even if you're in the street and you saw something wrong, I think our reaction is to look around us in the immediate vicinity and try to tell someone, hey, do you see what I'm seeing? Right? You want to be able to discharge that obligation. And I think human beings need to be given that opportunity. And at the same time, companies need to be given that opportunity to fix it, which is where there's this balance. Because of course we can go binary, right? We can be like, oh, it's all about whistleblowers. They need to be protected. They need to be able to flag things. The company shouldn't be doing something wrong anyway. And then you can also go your company and start attacking whistleblowers. But I think where we need to understand is balancing both, because it's not fair if you're a senior executive. You've been in a situation where one day you woke up and you read about your company in the newspaper, for example, and you legitimately didn't know. But had you known, you would have been able to rectify or do something about it. So I think we got to be fair both ways. And that's also why I posted what I posted on LinkedIn, because that goes into a whole, I would say, controversial, not often discussed topic. And as you could see from some of the comments, it got quite charged. But I think we need to be alive to the fact that not every whistleblower is an angel, for example. And also what constitutes whistleblowing versus what constitutes actually gaming the system and actively blackmailing a company.
And I love the fact that you unpicked that, because I think you're absolutely right. The common narrative is, here's somebody who's doing the right thing against evil company. And of course that is going to be true, right? You're a great example, right, of calling something out that needed to be called out. But this is a really nuanced thing. And so I love this idea that you've kind of exposed it a little bit. Because I think if you sort of said to people, what is whistleblowing? You're right. It would be plucky individuals speaking up against the evil machine. And of course, that's not the real world is complicated and challenging and nuanced. And so I love the fact that you've kind of just gone, well, what do we mean by that? And, as you and I were talking earlier, I've seen examples of people who have engaged in criminal activity who are sort of trying to reframe themselves as whistleblowers. It's kind of like, well, I got caught But then I cooperated with the authorities. So that makes me a whistleblower. And I can understand the attraction of that. And then, of course, there will be people who I think have been incredibly helpful, right, have gone beyond the duty. And so probably sit close to that. But this isn't a kind of binary thing. There's a heck of a lot of motives and dynamics and fact patterns that go into this whole exercise. So I love that you've just started to unpick it and say, we really need to think about it. And the point you made in the LinkedIn post was that there's a very fine line. Somebody could sit either side of that line, and what's a good whistleblower versus a bad whistleblower, malicious. So I think this is really interesting nuanced stuff that is, again, the topic's quite difficult to get to grips with when you get that. But I think it's really important that we open this box and start to reflect on the fact that it's not as simple as it might seem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can call it like the gray zone problem. To give an example, there's a real pattern that I've observed. For example, someone notices serious accounting irregularities. Instead of reporting it, they meticulously, say, document it over months while dropping subtle hints to management about their concerns. What they're actually doing is building leverage, not protecting stakeholders. I mean, the challenge is they're using the same documentation practices, which legitimate whistleblowers would need for protection. But we must here look at the intent and pattern of behavior, right? And personally, like firsthand, I have been in situations, even in the Wirecard case, where I have come across these individuals. What they're actually doing is just angling for a payout. But technically, if you use a legal, I mean, that's the problem with the definition, right? Like, what is a whistleblower? If you go by the legal definition, someone that reports maybe in the public interest and, about wrongdoing in a company, potentially gets a SEC or reward for that. It could also be someone raising a concern to the relevant authorities or to those in power. So technically that would cover both legitimate whistleblowing as well as illegitimate bad actors. But then where do we draw the line for blackmail, right? Of course, whistleblowers need protection because of the risk that comes with the role, with any kind of raising of concerns to people in power. But then, it's a very complicated topic. Like, we could go on for hours on this. So what's also interesting is how I've progressed, because initially I used to, and I still probably do, say we shouldn't consider motive so much. But I think now, yeah, and the reason why I say we shouldn't consider motive is because if you're a business executive and you receive the whistleblowing report, why do you care what the motive behind the report is if objectively on the facts of the report, you need to do something? Because if you don't, there will be a real bad outcome on your company's business, right? So that kind of motive, I think what I was trying to say is we should look at the facts of the case of the report objectively at the very first instance, instead of what seems to be, to me, the knee-jerk reaction at the first instance, which is, who is this person? Why are they reporting? What's their game? So I think that question should be part. But then at the same time, as I came up with this LinkedIn post, those things would potentially be relevant. But the question is when and how, right?
It's interesting because I'd always sort of glibly just said, what are we trying to do with whistleblowing? We want people to speak up at the right time, right? Because there's no good them speaking up after the event, right? We want to catch things beforehand. And then I always used to just add, for the right reasons. And I couldn't ever quite justify it. It just seemed to me that we didn't want to encourage people to maliciously use it. And you could sort of see that if somebody was a poor performer, felt that they were under threat, what's the first thing you do? Well, I'll grab whatever I can as a means of protecting myself. And so you could sort of naturally see that if you come across something, you can make a big issue out of something small. You might actually genuinely know something that you might otherwise not be motivated to do that. And so I thought it was relevant and significant. And I think the way you've articulated it helps me to think about that a bit more, because it does matter. Motivate, it's not just purely, we've got some new information that's somehow come to us. We do need to start thinking about that. But it's almost one of these situations where, in order to protect those obvious cases where people genuinely are doing the right thing, we have to build that. So those protections can also help people that are doing it, I guess, maliciously in extreme. So it's a really interesting challenge. But I think shying away from the complexities of it doesn't help us, right? We could pretend that this was really simple, that it is just a simple case of people, well, it's always going to be this. But actually, what is whistleblowing? Why do people do it? If we really want to get systems in place that will work and that will encourage the right behaviors, then we need to think about this and we need to unpick those dynamics. So the box that you're opening, if you like, I think is a really important one.
Yeah. And I mean, having thought about it as well, I don't My concern comes more from compliance and legal experts doing this more than the generic employee that saw something bad and was like, okay, I'm going to raise this because it doesn't make sense. But more on those experts that actually, perhaps for an insidious reason, and again, I actually have met these people in my lifetime, go into companies and carry out a gap analysis and then build that gap analysis to a situation where what they're actually doing is making themselves more indispensable because of the knowledge they know about the wrongdoings to the C-suite. And then having that kind of leverage is, well, I guess in a Machiavellian way, strategic for job prospects. But then is it truly ethical? I don't know. And then what happens if things go down, right? And you get into a blackmail scenario. So, assuming now you've been caught out for whatever and the company wants to fire you and you start saying, look, you want to fire me? Then I'm going to now expose you for all these things. Because technically I've got a case, I've got a channel to regulators to flag these wrongdoings. I don't want to be fired. So then in that situation, how would the company react? It's super complicated. How do you now deal with this employee that's got, because what has happened is a kind of like a Quentin Tarantino film, right? You've got both parties pointing guns at each other. Who's going to shoot first? So that's why it's complicated. And that's why I think from a leadership, from a management standpoint, it's very interesting because what I'm coming up with in this example is not so out there that it doesn't happen, I think, or at least that's my view. But again, it needs to be dealt with because the reason why this could also potentially be an important discussion point is would regulators see this kind of behavior and potentially then disqualify rewards? Because if they could, then I think that's some form of addressing the situation. But if they don't, then the bad actors pretty much gotten away with it.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think what's fascinating is the logic of rewarding whistleblowers. Makes perfect sense because you'd sit there and say we need people to come forward, and on a basic level, financial rewards, and we know this from other situations where we need people to step outside the norm and do things that might be perceived to be personally risky. If we put a reward in place, we will get a different behavior. And one of the reasons you might reward whistleblowers is if there's a perception that it could cost you your job, you're going to need some kind of income stream going forward. So there's a very simple logic of incentives that say this is why we have to have that. But at what point does an incentive become a kind of honeypot where you go, well, that looks like an easily accessible thing? And back to, for example, I don't know, rogue trader or something, deciding that they're going to engage in that activity. And my backstop position is, well, I can also frame it as a whistleblower. So if I either just before I get caught or after I get caught, I can then use that. And that could become an attractive mechanism. So it's a brilliant example of an unintended consequence. And so I love this idea of the simple analysis is, well, we'll just reward people, right? That solves the problem. The more complex analysis, well, hold on a minute. As with all reward schemes, there are unintended consequences. And that's the one you've just highlighted. So we need to think in a really interesting, nuanced way about how do we structure rewards. And I guess to your point, you probably need a layer of judgment there because the moment you start to codify, well, what is a genuine, we would pay out under these circumstances, but not these circumstances. It's a really challenging example of codification because I guess you'd need human judgment in each case to say, well, look at the facts of it, rather than trying to pre-codify this stuff, because you don't, as is common with lots of whistleblowers, you don't necessarily know what's going to come up. You don't know who it is that's going to bring information. You don't know what it is. You don't know the set of circumstances. So trying to codify this stuff's quite hard.
Yeah, I would suggest like clean hands principle would apply in this situation. So of course, if you have a legitimate whistleblower, whoever, whatever role that person may be in, they raised an issue because they wanted it fixed and for no other reason. There was no evidence of them wanting to financially get rewarded or be silenced for their knowledge. It's a clear step process. Raised the issue, tried to get the issue resolved, tried to stop the wrongdoing, in the end had to suffer retaliation and were left with no choice but to now defend themselves for the very simple fact that they tried to raise an issue and it offended people, right? I think those scenarios would be what I would term clean hands whistleblowing. And it's quite easy in a way to categorize people that way. Where it gets complicated, and it's again, I'm insisting this is not an uncommon issue because we know that in most organizations, there have been cases of settlement agreements that have been put in place. Now, why are these settlement agreements in existence, right? It's clearly because something was wrong and you now needed to settle financially with someone. So they go away and they don't disparage you or sue you or raise that same thing that was settled for. So I think it broadens the scope from whistleblowing to these things as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a complicated scenario. I'm a strong believer of financial rewards because of the fact that in a lot of clean hands whistleblowing cases, careers are damaged. Retaliation is mentally, emotionally, and financially strenuous. And when you go into things like what happened in the Jaguar whistleblowing case, for example, the company took an active step to blacklist that person from future job opportunities. Now you've killed the person's professional role, not only in the company, but you've also done it outside to the market. So now you've kicked the rice bowl, and all that person did was try to flag something in good faith, right? So I think in these situations, morally, we need to find a hope to support these people, because what happens if for 5, 6 years they don't get a job and have families to feed, right? And then, of course, if the government wants to throw a sweetener in it, like the way a lot of tax authorities do, then yeah, by all means, everyone kind of, for lack of a better term, wins in that case. So yeah, I am for that. What I'm not for is extreme cases in some jurisdictions like the US, where, the rewards are just so obscenely enticing that there's just very little incentive to raise this issue and get it resolved internally, especially if it's very serious. And then you have like in Malaysia where there's a whistleblowing act. But in order to qualify for protections under that act, your very first point of contact where you raise that issue has to be the regulator, not anyone inside the company. Because even if you told your boss or whatever, and it failed, and now you went and tried to get protection under that act, that fails. You don't qualify. So in these extreme scenarios, we need to stop pulling people out at first instance out of companies, whether for protections or for financial rewards, but find a middle ground where they raised it internally, then failed, and then they went outside.
So that's really interesting, because I've got this CEO in mind that you mentioned before that sort of like is blindsided by something. Well, nobody told me. And you're right. If you've designed structures externally, if the government structure is come to us first, and you can sort of see the logic that gets you there, which is kind of FBI informant logic, right? We don't want you revealing the investigation, right? So we want to keep the secret so that we can prosecute. So there is a kind of governmental logic to that. But that doesn't help us if I'm being actively disincentivized to report these things internally, particularly if there's a big pot of money at the end of it. You could totally see why that would go wrong. And so that's fascinating. And the level of nuance that you're talking about here is quite challenging. So I could even see well-intentioned politicians who recognize the need to financially reward people could design things that don't really reflect the realities of the challenges that people face. And that's where I think your perspective as someone that's been through this is incredibly valuable, because, I can sort of imagine what it must be like and the pressures that you're under. But as with all these things, right, until you've done it, I think it's really difficult to know exactly what that would feel like. And I'm guessing as well, in a situation of huge stress, it's quite hard to think clearly sometimes, particularly where you're weighing up the kind of the internal pressure that we need to really help people here and have very, very clear paths. And I think it's interesting that when we think about how difficult it is sometimes to get people to speak up, if we don't have clear structures, then we're obviously going to get unintended consequences, because this stuff is difficult. This isn't, back to the earlier point I made, this isn't something people are doing every day. This is a big step for many people. And so we really have to think through this clearly. And that level of nuance isn't obvious unless you start to look at the topic.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the reason why I think about these things also is because I have been a general counsel a few times. And I work most of the times with the C-suite, and have in my capacity as counsels come across bad actors within companies, or also obviously drafted settlement agreements for a lot of these employees. So I see it from that side. You have to balance, as I say, protecting the company, sometimes just dealing with a person in the most sensible way. So yeah, I mean, in Wirecard's case, for example, right, I was the head of legal for the Asia Pacific region. There was an internal whistleblower that came to me. I protected that person. That person was extremely fearful of her life. and I never revealed who it was. So within Wirecard, I was dealing with the whistleblowing case. And then I became the whistleblower, but outside my employment of Wirecard. So it's a case of two kinds of whistleblowing in a way. But where I see the rewards would be to that person that came to me, right? Because, what happened to that person? Is she okay? Did she then get a job? Has she been retaliated against by the very people that hired her, who she sought to expose? I wouldn't mind in any sense of conscience to say that I think that person deserved some form of a reward for her courage and what she had to go through, and probably, maybe, hopefully not, might still be going through. So I think that level of thanks should be there and reward. For myself, I never got a single cent. So even though and the reason why was also because of anonymity, right? I was extremely concerned and put complete focus on being anonymous. And that also meant I couldn't go to regulators, including the SEC or DOJ, for example, because by doing that, I would potentially have to reveal myself. So it's just very different. But then on hindsight, people always ask me in my keynotes, do you regret what you did? I say no. Then they ask, would you have done anything differently? Of course, as a human being, like all human beings, if someone wants to pay you a huge amount of money for what you went through or what you did, would that be nice? Yeah, definitely. It's going to be tight. I could fund my existing startup all the way and do something good out of it. So yeah, I mean, maybe if there's one thing I would change, would be potentially it would have been nice to get some form of thank you, even a verbal one or one on a letterhead from somebody out there, whether it's a German government or whoever, right? Because I think this is important in terms of sending a message to people that, okay, you may not become supremely rich with rewards financially, but you would be, because of the thanks, the pat on the back, or whatever you want to call it, the assistance, maybe, helping you get another job or whatever. It shows that there is light at the end of the tunnel, a bright light, and it's not just all gloom and doom.
And that's really interesting, because if we think about other content, because you could make an argument and saying, well, obviously speaking up is the right thing to do, and therefore we would expect people to do that. But I think we can think of lots of other contexts where if we think about the way, somebody that goes above and beyond in a military context or in a healthcare context, we do reward those people on some level, and there is recognition that this is an important thing. And so I think you make it an interesting point there, that if we just relied on the fact, well, obviously it's the right thing to do. We're taught that as kids, right? That we should do these things. We should speak up if we see something that's inappropriate. But I think recognizing that we do need to have these extra things in place, I think is really important. And I love the fact that you've brought up, of course, financial is one thing, but I think this recognition piece is a really interesting one. And it strikes me, this is a really key dynamic. We need to think about the humans and what motivates them. And we can't just rely on this is the right thing to do, therefore people will do it, because this is difficult and challenging. And there's a human being there that's being asked to step out and do something. And I think rewarding that in terms of saying it's the right thing, recognition, absolutely key. But that's missed, right? It feels unnecessary, I guess. But, based on your experience, I think absolutely a clear demonstration of why it does matter.
Yeah. And we could go one step further and say that this is truly what it means to be toned from the top, right? Because this would be the ultimate tone from the top.
Oh, I love that.
Where it is society and the government changing that mindset as to how these people are viewed, instead of viewing them as rats and snitches or whatever. It could spark a ultimate tone from the top down, that these things would be rewarded with a pat on the back. And again, what this pat on the back is, whether it's financial or it's, not everyone is driven 100% by money. Like if I was sitting here and I had a nice plaque from the EU, for example, or for the German government saying, thank you for your service in exposing this massive scandal, for example. I think I could just look at that piece of paper with a lot of pride, and I could use that and live till my end of days saying, this is what I achieved. I may not have gotten any money out of it, but that's what defined me and made me feel proud of myself. And, that simple thing could have a lot of motivation type effects on a human being. It could chart their career, it could chart their path, like in a way what it's done to mine. And it could also give you some form of recognition for like-minded individuals, right? They may want to talk to you. They may want to get you to to speak to motivate other people. And then that creates a kind of chain effect where that top down, as I said, it changes everything. So yeah, again, very, very complicated, quite hard to articulate these things, but I hope you get the gist of what I'm trying to say.
I'm struck as you're talking there about, other people and networks and appreciation. Obviously, one of the things that's interesting, you mentioned this when you were talking about the solution that you're coming up with, is recognizing the loneliness. Because as you're going, there's an interesting thing there where, as you're going through the process, you are very much on your own by default. There's a secret there that that you need to reveal, and you have to be careful with what you do that. So that's quite a lonely thing. And so, to a certain extent, what you're talking about here is, I guess, balancing that out, really, to say that, okay, the loneliness, the difficulty, the challenge, the stress is worth it because I guess I get the human touch at the end of it, right? I get a feeling that society, whatever that means, views what I've done positively. And so the reason I would go through this really difficult, challenging bit is because I will get that warm glow at the end of it. And that's the sense that probably the light at the end of the tunnel, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I think, there are business leaders out there that would value such individuals because they would rely on, if not the sheer honesty of these people, to tell them when something's wrong. And I think, if you are right, a sound-minded, reasonable CEO or business leader, you would want to surround yourself by people that would actually tell you the truth, right? And not just yes men. So I think especially for a general counsel position, for a compliance position, even a risk role, you need that level of honesty, and you need to be able to hire people that will tell you if something doesn't make sense, if something is wrong, or if anything is happening within your company that you should be aware of. I don't think this is ratting on anything. It's actually just elevating or escalating risks and bringing awareness to things that are problems.
But that's where that distinction that you made earlier between what you might term malicious whistleblowing and actually clean hands whistleblowing is really important, because I think the narrative, you see a lot of narrative of nobody wants to hire whistleblowers, right? Because they're viewed as troublemakers. And part of that is polluted by, I guess, a fear that I don't want to hire this person because they're going to cause a fuss, or they're going to cause problems, or they're a bit awkward. And so the way that positive framing, that works if somebody is seen, not to have had a personal agenda, right? It's just genuine doing it for the right reasons. And so to avoid a little bit of that pollution, I think that as you're talking, it strikes me that we need to get into this level of detail, because if we want to solve that problem of nobody wants to hire whistleblowers, the reasons you wouldn't want to hire them is I don't want a troublemaker on board. Well, and I know one person's troublemaker is another person's constructive critic, whatever you call it. But we do need to get into these topics, because that's part of the reason, I guess, why you'd say, well, I don't want to hire anybody that's been a whistleblower because that's just going to cause me problems. What might they do in my organization? Look at the problems they caused over there. If you could start to think about these topics much more, we could start to recognize exactly the power that you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's funny in a way because companies do engage in gap analysis exercises, oftentimes very expensive ones. They hire audit firms, forensic firms, or even lawyers, right? Tell us where our holes, our gaps are. I don't know, maybe if that could be a role there for a whistleblower, if you think that person does nothing but look for issues within your company, maybe that's the job created for them. And in that way, it's also managed, right? It's managed. I mean, and this is not, again, it sounds funny, but that's exactly what happened now that I think about it in the hacking space, right? You had the black hats, you had malicious hackers, and then people hired them to do the very same thing. And then they became white hat hackers. So in a way, there is a parallel there. I mean, this conversation is making me really think of all these things.
But I think that's interesting. Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I was thinking in the context of, lots of people that call in consultants, auditors, lawyers, right? Bring in someone external to tell us what's going on. But in many cases, that's done because it's controllable, right? So we all know situations that strategy consultants are brought in to basically confirm the strategy the CEO's already decided is valid, right? Let's look, we got, well, let's name that, right? We've got McKinsey or whoever it is right in, and we know that there's very tightly defined thing. In other words, there's less risk of embarrassment, right? They're generally speaking, if something's gone wrong, then somebody comes in and they're sort of allowed to expose things.
Yes.
Particularly if there's been a change of management, right? You can do that was the last lot. We could, We see the same thing in politics, right? But there is a certain amount of control that you have. I guess the interesting thing about bringing whistleblowers, you don't call, well, they might find anything, right? Which is exactly what you ought to want, and you probably claim to want. But I can see that being a challenging thing, which again, I guess is down to we need to have a sense of that we've got people doing it in, for the right reasons, willingness to be. But I do love that idea of saying it's a skill that I've developed. And we you're right, because it's sort of like if you're a forensic accountant, right, you spend or a detective or whatever it happens to be, you've built a career out of things. You've got experience in uncovering things. And so I love this idea of saying, actually, if somebody has had an experience in their life that has demonstrated they have the capability and willingness often against great odds and challenges to speak up, that's a skill that we ought to value. And therefore, actually, that, finding the right outlet for that skill is a really great way of looking at it. I love that. I love that idea. So we just need to start constructing. I think, people would say, well, we don't want a mischief maker on board. I would argue that, it's a case of saying, find a construct that allows them to deploy that. I guess they might be viewed with suspicion within the organization, but that's a secondary challenge to solve. But the idea of here's a core skill set that's useful to us, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's no different in a way from internal audit. That's a very isolated role in a way, because everyone looks at them and like, okay, these guys probably going to find issues here and there, right? But I think the problem is the entire assumption that has underpinned this whole level of thinking is the fact that once a whistleblower, always a whistleblower. But I think that's not necessarily true, because I think most whistleblowers were forced into that position, or they're just unfortunate enough to be in that situation. I don't think they actively sought again, and this is where the extortion example kicked in. I don't think they actively went to a company to find issues which they wanted to escalate for some kind of reward. They were just in an unfortunate situation. They paid the price for it. But the question then is, what do we do with these people? So in my case, for example, after I came out publicly, I was working in a crypto company, and crypto has always been viewed with suspicion from a regulatory angle, right? How clean is the business, how this and that. But what the company actually did was they PR'd my whistleblowing experience in order to justify that what they're doing is definitely going down the right track. Because what they were saying is we would never have hired Pav as our head of risk and compliance, for example, if we wanted to do the wrong thing. So
yeah, if we want literally yes man, right? You're not the guy to hire.
So that's an extremely powerful PR exercise, because even from the regulator standpoint, they're like, okay, that kind of makes sense. So yeah, I mean, it's really, but who's advising these people? Who's giving them counseling? Who's giving them support? Who's motivating them with even these topics that we're discussing, right? They are, as you said, very isolated. They're lonely. They're battling all kinds of feelings of injustice, internal, psychological, could be also from the family. Why did you do this? Why do you have to be a hero? Now we've got no salary. Was it all worth it? So there needs to be some form of maybe education or counseling. I don't know. But I think that's where the problem really lies.
There's an interesting dynamic that I've observed, and I don't want to generalize here, but I've seen certain people that have been whistleblowers that seem very, very angry and adopt a kind of, if you're not with us, you're against us. And so I've had exchanges with people on LinkedIn, to put it mildly, where it's kind of like, anybody that isn't hiring whistleblowers automatically is part of the problem. That's sort of quite divisive language. And when I first saw it, I was like, well, no, not surprised no one's going to hire you because you're clearly just an aggressive. But having stepped back a bit and reflected on it, I can completely see the dynamics that you're talking about, because it is, I mean, it must be traumatic on some level. And I'm assuming that they're in the same way that we haven't really thought through some of the other structures. There's not going to be a kind of, even in the military where we know it's obvious, right? We don't necessarily look after veterans knowing that they will have PTSD and other challenges. So I'm guessing here there's next to no support, right? Because it's sort of back to, I guess, that presumed, well, you're doing it for the right reasons. We don't need to, but actually there's a level of psychological support that seems to me to be really significant and important here that clearly isn't there.
Yeah. I mean, of course, I know a lot of these individuals myself. And what I found is the common theme, or at least that's my theory, is there's not been any closure. And these whistleblowers who remain angry and disgruntled is really for the very fact that nothing was ever done. Instead, they were the ones attacked and they suffered. And these same people that they were trying to expose are now even more empowered, more successful. Nobody cared. So I think it's that lack of closure, that sense of injustice, which makes them very upset because they're still stuck in that position where why did this whole thing happen? Like, where's the level of sanity here, right? Why did I have to suffer? Why did the wrongdoers get even more emboldened and more enriched and successful? Like, why isn't anyone listening to me? So I think that's the reason why they become very aggressive and they still are on that same mission. And in a way, it's very hard to move on. So again, it's a very serious issue. So on one hand, they can be really annoying, even to me, because they just flood your LinkedIn posts and they just attack everyone. And in that way, they further ironically isolate themselves. But then on the other hand, there's a level of empathy and sympathy as to how do you help this person move on? How do you kind of jujitsu their angst into something more positive, like maybe like what we discussed, give them some role and a forensic person, someone that can now go in and channel that energy into other companies that might be doing these things, or funnily also support other whistleblowers in that space. So I think that it's a very big topic. It spans legal, compliance, risk, psychology, behavioral science. Yes, but it's something that I think, at some point would need to be discussed. So maybe even you could, with your skill set, explore a lot of these topics.
I do think it's really interesting, and it plays into one of my key themes is that we often design the world, and this is compliance programs, but I guess societally sort of things we're talking about, for the way we would like people to behave rather than the way they're likely to behave. Right? In other words, we have this sort of rose-tinted view of the world, and by designing systems for the perfect human being that can tolerate a whole load of stress, that will just do the right thing all the time, that doesn't have a whole load of other things going on in their lives, we design systems that just don't work. And so we have to, it's a little bit like performative compliance training, right? We've all been there. So pointless training where they teach you stuff you don't need to know. That's never going to be relevant. That's boring. That doesn't achieve any objective. Or we design idealistic rules around things and idealistic principles. And so I think this is a really interesting illustration of this isn't just a case of switch on the whistleblowing machine, right? And we'll just say we want this stuff and job done, right? We'll announce that we want this and how important this is, and that's where I think this comes back to your thinking about the psychological bits of it as well. And so I think that's a really fair challenge to me to say, actually, you need to expand this thing, because if this is a dynamic we genuinely want to have happen, and we say that we do, but question whether we do, then we need to create the environment that makes that more likely, that supports exactly that. And I think it's a really interesting point you make. And we've got nowhere near that. But the only way we can get to that, back to the early conversation, is if we're honest about the underlying dynamics, right? That we don't look at everything as a very simple, people that are speaking up are good, companies are bad, or organized societies. But we have to get into that nuance and really start to appreciate it. And that's complicated. It's much easier to keep it at a simple level.
Yeah, it's true. And, I'm a big fan of the law and economics movement myself. But again, that's predicated purely on cost benefit analysis and assuming human beings are rational actors. I think just when during the course of discussion as well, I'm also thinking of an analogy to threat actors in the cybersecurity space, right? So they have hacked your company. They now want to pay out. But the moral dilemma and the practical dilemma is always, okay, we pay these people out. They've agreed that they won't leak the data that they've stolen. But then that underlying threat is always there. How can we trust them? How do we know that this thing from a company standpoint has closure as well, right? So I think if we parallel that from back to the whistleblower, we've signed a settlement agreement or somebody has reported them, would this actually mean the case is closed, or would this recur again? So again, yeah, it's very complex. I think there's analogies to various things.
And I love that idea of, because you talked about closure on behalf of the whistleblower, but that's a really interesting flip, right? To the closure on behalf of the company. Is this now done, or is this ever going to linger over us? And I guess, it's an interesting thing if we look at what's happening with NDAs and some of the egregious uses of NDAs that we've seen, where there's a movement there, quite understandably and quite rightly, to have that, the power that those have and the situations in which those are used heavily restricted. You could start to see actually the dynamics that you're talking about there become more challenging, because companies kind of go, well, actually, if I wanted closure from a corporate perspective, I want to close the door and don't want to have this topic re-arising again. Some of the mechanisms that one might have thought could secure that are starting to. So this gets even more complicated. And again, if we start to think about the predictable and likely behavior of people within organizations who have it, incentivized to protect the status quo, nothing to see here, good PR, all that stuff, you can see why this is really challenging. And so I guess to a certain extent, I can see why the box that you're opening with these questions and thoughts, we should open it, but again, it's really difficult, right? It's almost like you are whistleblowing on the whistleblowing dynamics.
Yeah, which is not my intention. I mean, I just want to raise these topics. We can't shy away from them. I think if we deal with difficult questions head on, that's how we become wiser as society and people. And it's very important, which is why also when I was designing the Confide platform, I had to make sure it's end to end. But funnily, the biggest difficulty became the end process, right? So how do you finish a whistleblowing report? How do you conclude it? Yes, you can have your internal report that goes to your board, but how have you concluded that with the person that was reporting, right? Was there a closure there? Did they sign a form saying, yes, this is now settled? And then we get into the slippery slope. That case was closed from the company standpoint, but maybe it wasn't done to the satisfaction of the person that reported it. Then what happens then? Right. And this is very prevalent, for example. I mean, I wouldn't say prevalent, that's a wrong term to use, but I can see this happening in the HR space because these are emotional, these are personal, and intangible to that sense. You can't really put what might be justice for the victim would be very different justice from the company's standpoint. So if a woman has been sexually harassed, for example, by a senior member of staff, behind the scenes, the company could have spoken to that person and said, look, the heat is too much. You have done something really wrong. I think you should resign, but we can do it quietly, right? Let's just find a balance here. So they may have agreed with, say, the COO that he would resign in 3-4 months' time, when reasons would not be published as to why the person's resigned. From the person reporting, they're like, the company's not doing anything. They have just taken my report. They told me they're dealing with the issue. They have taken steps to deal with it, but what is it? And then what happens if the company actually says, yeah, we told him to resign. He'll get 3 months notice period, whatever, he will leave. What if that's just not good enough for this person? And they want even more. They just now want, like, they find this whole process wasn't to their satisfaction. And then what happens, right? So I think that's where closure on all fronts, it's a theme, it's a key. It needs to be thought about. And it also goes to NDAs, because NDAs in a lot of contexts are meant to be the closure, meant to take that money in these kinds of cases, like the Stormy Daniels case with Trump. You're supposed to take that money and then go away. You're not supposed to come back later and, demand more. Because if we allow that, then what's the whole point of the NDA in the first place? The person that paid the amount to settle the case, he thought he's finished his side of the bargain. You accepted it. From an offer and acceptance standpoint, that was a deal that was done. Why is it being reopened now? Because if we go down this track, then you're making a mockery of the law technically and contract law. So yeah, it's fascinating. It's fun. I guess as we said at the start, this could go on forever having these discussions, but I think they're super exciting. I think if you like intellectual conversations, if you like think about stuff, if you don't like to be in one camp or the other camp, then these are things that will fascinate, and there are debates and discussions which leadership teams should think about, which people in our community in governance, risk, and compliance should think about. And let's just talk about it.
And I mean, we talked about people that are angry. You seem exactly the opposite, right? You seem very chilled and happy and engaged, and you're smiling, right? And we're talking about a really serious subject. And I think it's fascinating. It seems to me that you have, one, because you found an outlet for the experience that you've been through, and that's driving your work and what you do. But I'm assuming a little bit as well, because you worked on the other side of the fence. You've got a more of a viewpoint as to what's going on behind the scenes, and so you understand the plumbing and the dynamics of what organizations are going through. And I'm assuming to that extent, it makes it a little bit easier for you. Whereas the average employee isn't going to have that level of visibility and knowledge and understanding of the process. And so, even if you couldn't see all the time what was happening, you've got some awareness of some of these parameters, right? So you would understand how this thing might close out or not close out. You've seen other people go through this. You understand why organizations might react in a particular way, which gives you a really unique set of circumstances. I'm assuming that's a key part of your ability to smile about this and sit and do what you do now and driving your mission, because I guess you were in the best possible position to navigate this, really, given your experiences.
I don't think anyone would be when they suddenly find everyone against them for doing their job or for raising a concern. Of course, I had a lot of challenges on my own. There were
Sorry, I wasn't suggesting it was easy, but I'm just thinking about relatively speaking.
Yeah, for sure. It's just a journey, I think, which it goes back to what I said, like that I had to find my own way to close this out and move forward. I don't want to. It's a difficult response to give because it could be seen as, he was a lucky guy and now he's happy that telling everyone what to do. I don't want to be in that situation. I think everyone is, by virtue of being a human on Earth, I think everyone suffers daily, and we go through life with all kinds of challenges, injustices, and stuff. But I told myself is how we come out of them. Do we want to ruminate on them? Do we want to go down that spiral, or do we want to say, okay, I accept what happened? I may not agree, I may not be happy with it, but now what do I do and what do I learn from this? And how do I make something positive out of it? It's very difficult. It's extremely difficult. But I think I told myself, okay, I've been given this platform. It was a very rare case of successful whistleblowing. So now what can I do with this platform and this voice and just, talk about it and spread the message and shine some light on people who are suffering and on companies to do the right thing. So that's just where I find myself. It's difficult. I mean, look at Wirecard, there's still these people on the run. And a lot of them are not even charged with cases. And there's huge injustices to, for example, investors and pension funds. Innocent ones that lost their money, employees that lost their money. All the lawsuits are failing against the auditors and also the regulators. And there is that level of injustice still there. So what do we do and how do we deal with it? I think we can only deal with ourselves and our surroundings. And from that level, and this is also from a top-down thing. So I did post on LinkedIn without wanting to rant on 51. I did post on LinkedIn that it's always too easy for us to just blame the top-down and the culture in the company is bad. But if we are business leaders or we are anyone in the company, we can create that little subculture among us. And we can be positive. We can be nice to our own peers. We can be nice to our subordinates. So what if our bosses are horrible people? If we can create that subculture, then we don't need to fall back on the top-down thing, right? So that's how I view things and how I try to live every day.
I love that because there's like a really empowering message here, right? And I think this is the what I love talking about this situation is it reminds me of, I mean, you were saying we should look at other situations, right? We can learn some lessons from other contexts. I think what's interesting about this is that you're raising some points that are fundamental across how we look at the world as humans, how we react to things, recognizing that life is not always going to go the way you want it. And, I'm really struck. This is an extreme example of, this is not career as planned, right? We can make these amazing plans for what we want to do with our lives, but things will happen that are totally out of our control. And it's a case of how we react to those that I think is the making of it. And so I love there's just a really positive sense of empowerment, like a really positive energy that just like it screams across the screen at me now as we're talking to each other. It's just like you've just gone, well, what can I do with this? Right. So this is it I mean, it's the classic turning potentially a threat, a challenge into something positive and driving it. And that plays itself out into much broader context than just the things that we're talking about here. But the energy that you bring to this subject is like it's infectious. Which is not something, it's kind of like, well, but it is, this is something really, really powerful that you've kind of grabbed. And I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I was asking myself, right? Like, what was the bigger purpose behind exposing Wirecard? And it took me a few years, and that's how Confide came about. I mean, I asked myself, like, what do I want my legacy to be? Do I want to be remembered as the Wirecard whistleblower only? Because I'm pretty sure they're going to be bigger and more and sexier frauds that happen that make people forget about Wirecard someday. But
Well, just inflation is going to drive, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's not like it's not like a league table that remains the same, right? Inflation is going to make that easier over time. So yeah, it's a great observation.
yeah, so I told myself, okay, I could do Confide as well. So I left a tangible product out there, and I kind of, linked that original legacy to this product. And yeah, okay, if it fails one day, that's fine. But people would remember that you tried, and they would remember the word Confide because it's so powerful for anyone in a speak up context. Because oftentimes, when you are in a situation where you want to raise a concern, you don't know who to confide in, right? Or you could be confiding in the wrong person, who then throws you under the bus. Or worse, you could be just prevented from confiding by things like NDAs or legal privilege and the like. So I think, yeah, that's fine. I have now put this energy into my keynotes, into the product, and I hope that would be a lasting one. But even if it isn't, I'm happy that the word went out, people became aware, and let's see what's next.
And there's two things I want to pick up on that. One is I love this idea that if you sort of have something, and I could see it'd be really easy to you are the Wirecard guy, right? Which is not you sort of go, well, if that's it, if that's then what's the point? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I love that idea of sort of go, okay, that's happened, right? So when we build from that, that's not the pinnacle of achievement or the badge, right? Because otherwise, it's like, what would you spend your time doing? You'd be sitting around doing nothing, right? I love the idea that you've taken that and gone, okay, that's there, but I need to build on that. There's something else there, right? There's a chance. So I think that's a really amazing thing, and I love that. The second bit is you talk about language, and I was going to ask you about the word confide because it's clearly carefully chosen, and I think you've nicely articulated there why you've done that. I think language really matters for the reasons that you just outlined, and so I wondered what are your views on the word whistleblow? Is that helpful or not? Because I've heard arguments made both ways. On the one hand, generally in life, when somebody in a sporting context, the person that's blowing the whistle isn't on our side, so that feels a negative thing. On the other hand, it does describe making a lot of noise. The term exists for a reason. What are your views on? I mean, you clearly use the word to talk about it yourself. Do you think that's problematic, or shouldn't we worry too much about it?
I mean, at some point, it is what it is, right? Like it has become this thing. People see it in mostly a negative light, but I think trending wise, it's becoming something more acceptable. Um, and at the end of the day, it's a fundamental human right to exercise the ability to articulate a concern, right? To speak. And I think that's what it is at the end of the day. So we should be in a society where we can say what we feel, and society can police that. So of course, if you're saying some pretty crazy stuff, then at some point you'll find yourself in a smaller and smaller circle. And so that kind of self check process, I believe, is healthier than not being allowed to speak or being forced to censor everything that you are saying. And yeah, it's weird, but I also raised this on LinkedIn in fact, it was my first post of this year where I wanted to open with the thought about um, self-policing. Because I think as human beings, when we are in a context or in a situation where we know what we're saying is going to be judged by in a more important way or in a more impactful way, we just think through what we say, hopefully, and then we massage it. We use different phrases. We try to be diplomatic, and especially in a work context, right? But then, that fear, or is it self censorship, or is it just what is that? Because if as business leaders we ourselves are scared to truly speak our minds, then how are we going to be telling other people to speak up if they see a concern? So I think that, and there's some level of hypocrisy there and fraudulent sense, right? Because we could just tell everybody, yes, speak up, but then are you as a person yourself speaking up the same way you want other people to in the work setting? Because if you're not, then well, what's going on?
There's so much in that because I think you're right. We don't want to be rude to people or upset them, but also we have to be honest, right? And so we sometimes choose the language that we use very carefully, and organizations and leaders in those organizations are careful sometimes with their words, which to your point can be inauthentic. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. I think the other bit I find fascinating is your point around leading with example. It was always the classic one. I always used to like the naughty question within organizations I've worked for, where you'd have someone in the senior leadership thing would say something like, "We need people to report errors or report mistakes, or report incidents, right? To find things that are not working the way they should." And so the question I'd always ask back is, well, when was the last time you reported something? And you get some nonsense about, well, I never see anything. And I'm like, well, that's not credible, right? Because there must be in your environment, there must be things that you're not happy with that aren't working perfectly. And if you're not doing it, why do you expect the rest of us to do it? And it always shocked people. That question was almost viewed as sort of disloyal. And it's like, why are you embarrassing me? And I'm like, I don't think the question's embarrassing. I think it's your answer that's embarrassing. And if you genuinely want people to do that, in the same way that you claim to lead in other fields, I think you need to do it in this field. And so I think that's it's a really important challenge that's missed, right? Which is, we need the rest of the organization to do this. But what are you doing? And how are you expressing yourself? And I think you've raised some really strong points there, which is all of this stuff to think about, because it's kind of like we need humans to be human, right? To speak up, to do those things that actually, if we're unencumbered, we can naturally do. But we also need to think about the human dynamics that will drive or prevent that. And that's why I really like your use of the word confide, because I think that speaks to us on some level. We understand what that means. And so as we look at interactions that organizations have with their employees, we need to be thinking about, well, how does this actually come across? What does this make human beings feel? And therefore, what is it likely to make them do or not do? And is that the outcome that we're looking for? And I think that's often missed.
Yeah, that's true. And one of the real life examples would be, I was talking to my co-founder and he would say, we need to hire so and so. That person's super intelligent. He's got a bit of ADHD, which is why he's completely like just speaks his mind and sometimes offends people. So what it made me think, how come if we say that person has got potentially ADHD, for example, why is that then suddenly okay? Do we really need to rely on do we really need to, have that as a fallback? Or can we just have people that are people and no matter what they are, they speak their mind? Of course, no one's asking you to be extremely rude and offensive and vulgar or profane or whatever. But I think we need to have that. We need to go back to, I think, how things were without wanting to sound old, where we could just sit around and we could just, feel safe among our peers and we could say things and we could leave that table potentially having upset someone, but not feeling that fear that would have a permanent impact or they would judge you in a very adverse way, in a lasting way.
So kind of almost like the family relationship,
Yeah.
right? Where you're bound together by something. And so, yeah, you can have arguments, typically holiday seasons when you get together as well. But you've got that construct that means actually ultimately it's okay, right? We'll work this through. And I think it's interesting when you talk about, neurodiversity. There's a guest I had on the show called Professor Ludmila Praslova, who's written this book called The Canary Code, which is looking at how do we make the world better, or how do we get the best out of neurodiverse people? And her point in there is to say, well, actually, if we design the world for neurodiverse people that caters for we also improve it for other people. And so if we can become more tolerant of different perspectives, people who might express themselves in different ways, we help the neurodiverse people, but we also help everybody else. And so I love the idea that you've brought that dynamic in there, because I think we need to think about the totality of humans and say what works for everybody. Because you're right, you don't want to be creating exceptions. It's okay for them to do that, but the rest of you can't. That feels unfair. But again, it's a basic fundamental human thing. And so if we start to approach these questions really by looking at these are really basic human needs, desires, instincts that you're talking about here. And if we can start to bring that in, then I think, it brings us neatly back to the whole principle of confide, right? You've thought about, well, I want to give this a name that is human. Because you could have come up with some funky name, AI report or something, right? I'm astonished it's not confide.ai or something, but it's as you look at it, right, as you're thinking about what is the visceral human experience that we have and what drives our behaviors. And that's why you've chosen that name. And that's why that I think is the key to thinking about these things, is that often we stylize the world. We design it in a particular way, the way it logically ought to be. But humans are complicated and messy, and we need to reflect that.
Yeah, that's true. And which goes back to confide, because I was inspired by things like confessionals in the Catholic Church. You could go behind that screen and you could just speak your mind, offend the priest on the other side, but it's fine. You're just saying what you want to say, right? But you're letting it out. So I think if we could create a product that would allow, at least in the corporate setting, people to let it out, and we are able to create the product in such a way where rants can be classified as rants, where serious issues can be classified as serious issues. They can be whether by the person or by the receiving party, or even automated to in some extent someday. Then we are providing a very safe space using technology for these things. And often people they're like, oh, we don't want to have this product in place because we don't want to have people abusing it for all kinds of trivial things. That's something that's real, but we've also found a way to deal with it. And I always tell these same business leaders, do not downplay these so-called trivial issues. Because if you had, 10 people ranting about how bad the coffee is in the pantry, that's a very powerful data point if you step back and think about it, because it could go to explaining things like why no one's coming to the office before 10 a.m., why everyone wants to work from home or something, or why the morale is down, right? It may not be a whistleblowing case, it may not be a serious issue, but it's still a data point, and it's still such an invaluable way to get feedback, to get into the minds of people that are working for you.
And I love this because I've always said to people, if you think about like reporting things within an organization, it might be a loose piece of carpet, or as you say, the quality of the coffee, or anything at all, right? Stuff that is sort of trivial. If you're not taken seriously with the trivial stuff, then it's not unreasonable to assume that they're not going to take the big stuff seriously at all. And so one of the things I've said to my clients is look at what are the reporting processes that aren't the high level stuff, right? What happens when I report a low level thing? Is it taken seriously? Does this organization suggest that it's interested in my views on things? Or are my views utterly irrelevant? I'm ignored and you don't really care, and you make it impossible for me to share things. Then don't be surprised when those higher level things get, that factors into it. I'm not saying that you say, well, they didn't answer the coffee, therefore they're not going to be interested in this more serious point. But you should look across the thing. And I think, again, that's very, very human. It's a little bit, I got a survey from a company the other day, and I was just like, I'm really pissed off with this company. And I can't be bothered to fill it in. Right, I'm just not even going to bother. Right, the relationship is destroyed. I'm not interested in telling you how to improve your customer experience because we're past that. I'm never going to be your customer again because you've irritated the hell out of me at another point. Now, there's not a direct analogy between me, what I might say to an employer and whatnot, but I think it's worth thinking about how humans react. And what you've beautifully outlined there is that we don't neatly bucket the world into big, serious stuff and small and trivial stuff, because there are small things that can really irritate me. Don't take me seriously on that. You've sent a signal to me. And we know that from our other relationships. And so I love the idea that you're looking at those things as well and thinking about the totality of human experience. And I love the idea of letting stuff out, right? That is the key bit. It's like when people are not able to say what they think and get things out of their system, it just stews up here. And I think that's a great way of looking at it. And I love the Catholic Church analogy, by the way. I think it's a really good illustration. It's a very powerful way of recognizing a basic human need to get stuff off your chest.
Yeah. And to me, this is very important because in the whistleblowing context, people go outside the company and they become your enemies when they feel that they're not being heard, right? Because you're ignoring them. In fact, you're going against them. They don't have an outlet. They're getting pushed into a corner. And at some point, they'll be like, there's nothing in this company that is safe for me. That's fine. I'm going to go outside and expose it. So that's what I think people need to understand and prevent.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's like companies spend loads of money on their alumni programs, right? Because they recognize that people might they may come work for you again. They maybe act as your recruiters. You want people that have previously worked for you to have a good experience, right? Remember you positively. So if we spend money on that, why are we not thinking about this? Because it's not just a case of people can be positive agents for you, right? They can act as negative agents, and that can have all sorts of impacts on you. So it's kind of interesting where we kind of get the issue, but we don't go to the point that you've made, right? Which is thinking that through of saying, well, actually, an employee is an agent on behalf, whether you want it or not. An employee is an agent on behalf of the organization. Now, you might think they don't have a very powerful voice. They're never going to be a customer of ours. They're never going to come and work here again. But they're out there acting on your behalf. And so why not try and influence that more positively?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's what we're trying to do, and make small changes as we can. But again, I'm very positive. I think we have seen massive movements take place. Like there was a Me Too movement. There was the ESG movement. Just a few years ago, if you told anyone that potential employees would be asking potential employers whether they have oat milk in the coffee or how many trees they're planting, people think you're mad. But it happened. It happened overnight. It happened in such a on such a scale. I think at some point this would hit the speak up aspect because ENS has been covered. Now it's G, right? And a lot of these things feed into that.
Amazing. But I could keep talking to you forever because I find what you say fascinating. You get my brain racing, which is always the biggest compliment I can pay anyone. I want to say thank you for everything that you do because I think you're an amazing voice, a very calm, considered voice, but a very powerful voice. I love what you're doing with Confide. So thank you for all of that. If people want to get hold of you, what's the best place to do that? If they want to hire you to speak or they want to find out more?
Well, probably LinkedIn. That's where I'm the most active. It's sad. That's my social media. But yeah, probably the easiest way is that, or, Confide's website, which is www.confideplatform.com.
Amazing. I will put links to those things in the show notes. And I can confess, it's not sad that you're active on LinkedIn because I love your content. It's spurred a load. And, as this conversation demonstrates, right, you always make me think about things in a positive way. It's a very engaging thing. You are somebody that I highly recommend people follow. So we'll put links to all of those things there. So thank you for that. But above all, right now, thank you so much for being an amazing guest on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Pav for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Pav and his platform Confide and for links to some of the LinkedIn posts we discussed, have a look in the show notes. You'll find those there. If you're interested in finding out more about this topic, you'll find links to related episodes, including the one featuring journalist and author Dan McCrum on Money Men, his book about Wirecard, as well as my discussion with Zelda Perkins, the whistleblower who broke her NDA to reveal secrets of Harvey Weinstein's behavior. If you're new to the show, thank you so much for joining me. You'll find over 300 episodes for you to catch up on at humanriskpodcast.com, and you can hear and subscribe to the show wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. I will be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thank you so much for listening.